Welcome to The Impact Equation, conversations with leaders shaping a brighter future. With me, Adam Pike.
And me, Rafi Adelstein. With our special guests, we unlock the secrets of those who dare to transform our world. We talk to architects of change, pioneers in their fields, working towards a brighter future for us all. In each episode, we dig into each element of the impact equation.
On today's episode, we're joined by Christopher Hook, Global Head of Sustainability Strategy at Uber. Having previously led sustainability strategy teams at Accenture, Chris joined Uber in 2019 to establish and run the first sustainability project, the London Clean Air Plan. Since then, Chris has taken on global responsibility for sustainability and has been the driving force behind the partnerships that Uber have built to help drivers and restaurants operate more sustainably. Chris has big ambitions for Uber, working across 70 countries to make car journeys and restaurant orders completely sustainable. Chris, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
So Chris, perhaps to kick us off, what was it about your early life that inspired you to commit to a career in impact?
That's a great question. I've been thinking about that a little bit actually in preparation for today. I don't know that it was obvious to me when I was a teenager or younger that this was something that I was going to end up doing. I was definitely aware of the issue. I lived in the countryside as a kid. I live in North London now, but I was very much brought up in the countryside. So I guess I had a kind of appreciation for the natural world. I remember feeling quite early in my life aware of the fact that there was a big change happening, and generally referred to as global warming at the time. But it wasn't necessarily where I thought I would put all of my professional time and energy. I was kind of focused on school and getting to university, and then thought I would work that out when I was a grown-up. But I did have a strong sense that I probably wanted to do more with my job than just sign in 9 to 5, go home at the end of the day, forget about it. I always knew it was going to be a big part of my life. I liked to throw myself deep into things. And so, as soon as I would think about what I would be doing in my career, I was pretty determined that I would feel like I was doing something that I was proud of and that I would be prepared to commit a lot of time to, and that would have an impact beyond just the impact it had on my life. And then a bunch of things coincided, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that meant that I ended up therefore putting time into this topic and thinking about how we start to address some of the many, many challenges posed by our breakdown of our climate.
Chris, would you mind sharing us some highlights of your sustainability work at Accenture?
Yeah, very happy to. So I found the sustainability practice at Accenture about halfway through my time there. So I started in 2010. Everything was very financial crisis-y at the time, and I spent a lot of time, like everybody else who started in that point in their career, trying to navigate my way through a world that was different to the one that I thought I was going to be graduating in. But by the time I got to halfway through, which was about 2014, 2015, there was this new team that had been created, which was a sustainability strategy team. And it was an evolution of a team that previously existed, which had been very focused on research and maybe working with some big NGOs to lobby and advocate for action on climate change, and was evolving into a much more business-focused team in the run-up to the Paris Agreement, where they would work with big companies who were starting to embed action on sustainability into their core company strategy rather than have it be this thing that lives off in the corporate affairs world or is maybe a foundation called CSR. And I was a corporate strategy person. I'd done that in a bunch of different settings, looking for ways to have a bigger impact, do something frankly a bit more meaningful. And so those two things came together. And I joined this team. And the very first project that I did ended up being a real highlight, which was with Unilever, who were obviously at the vanguard of a lot of this transition. It was in the middle of Paul Pullman's time as CEO. The Sustainable Living Plan was pretty established by that point, but there were still some pretty big questions for them to answer in terms of what kind of value is this driving for the business? How do we take it further? How do we go faster? Can we really execute on this strategy? And so me and the team went in and did a pretty rapid assessment of a whole bunch of different business opportunities presented by the Sustainable Living Plan and tried to express the impact that we thought they could have on the bottom line as well as on their sustainability goals. And it was a brilliant introduction to that world and a way of thinking through some of these problems. And then we ended up spending a bit of time there and doing some deeper dives and learning all about shampoo sachets in South Asia, or how you get water out of products in Brazil, and just trying to really ground it all in a business case and simultaneously understand enough about the issue and the impact and the constraints from a sustainability perspective to make it work. So I love that project. probably the reason I then stayed and did more of it, because that one had been such a great introduction. And so I really enjoyed it. And probably the other one that stands out for me is a little later, where I joined forces with another group within Accenture called the Accenture Development Partnerships, which was designed to serve the kind of charity and NGO sector, but to use a lot of the same skills and experiences. And I joined up with them, and we did some work with GlaxoSmithKline and Save the Children. They had at the time a fairly new partnership where they had joined forces to roll out a bunch of health interventions in key markets, in vaccine programs, awareness programs, some drug development stuff. And they wanted someone to come in and again assess the efficacy of that program, the value that it was driving for both organizations, and essentially whether or not they should renew it and they should go again. And it was a pretty new space for me. It was a different type of sustainability, less environmental, much more social in its focus. Really fascinating to see how these two wildly different organizations came together with this common purpose. Clearly very important issue. And I really enjoyed that piece of work too. It was clear pretty early in the project that they should definitely go again, which they did, which was great to see. And actually, I saw quite recently the chap that we worked with is still there, still at GSK.
Awesome.
And they're 10 plus years into the partnership now and having a massive impact. So they were definite highlights for me in that time.
Sounds like some awesome examples. And obviously we know each other because at the time when you were doing all that, I was doing something similar at Deloitte, doing similar things and similar examples.
That's right.
That's what you just described. What would you say you took away from your experience of consulting that you've now been able to lean on as you've gone into an in-house role at Uber?
Yeah, I learned a lot as a consultant. So I came in straight out of university, thought I knew a lot, knew actually very little, certainly knew very little about work and how to get stuff done at work and how to think things through. And I learned, I think most of all, just a set of tools and techniques for how you break down a problem. Get given a fairly nebulous question, lots of people have got an opinion on it. How do you organize yourself and a team around answering that problem and then work through a good recommendation? And in consulting, that's the whole ball game. Like in the consulting, that's the point of the exercise, and then you step away and someone else takes or leaves your recommendation. And in an in-house role, you then got to stick around and also do it. And that's kind of why I wanted to make that change. And we can talk a bit about that maybe. But I use those skills, I guess, like every day still, in terms of, is this communication clear? Have we thought logically about the different parts of this problem? Is this person being consulted? Is that person being consulted? Are we building consensus around what we're trying to do? Like all of those things I think are pretty lift and drop from my life as a consultant. And then the second thing is probably a degree of confidence or comfort with not knowing the answer to something or being in a new space, having to learn something quite quickly. I mean, I liked that. I liked that when I was at school. I liked it at university. It was one of the things that really attracted me to consulting in the first place, was that sense of novelty. But you get thrown into a lot of, that example I just gave you with GlaxoSmithKline, Save the Children. Like, I didn't know much about either of those organizations. I certainly wasn't an expert in the space. I wasn't being brought in to be an expert in the space. That's kind of an important thing to remember, I think, all the way through. But you still have to be able to go into a room and ask sensible questions and listen properly and process the information in a useful way. And I feel like I draw on that a lot now too, where the context is different, but there's a confidence and an ability that you're going to be able to get up the learning curve quickly, and you're going to enjoy that experience of getting up the learning curve.
That resonates a lot with me, especially this idea that, you're there to say yes. You're there to say yes to sort of figuring out problems, and you throw yourself into it and you have the confidence to do so. So what was it that took you to say yes to Uber? Talk us through the sort of journey from consulting into that in-house role, and what it was about the sort of, the opportunity that attracted you and drew you in.
I've talked to a few people about this, and I think it was a healthy combination of me doing things on purpose and a lot of luck. But the things that I did on purpose were, I was ready after almost 10 years to try something different. I felt like for all that I'd loved about consulting, I was probably ready to try my hand at a different way of solving those problems I just described. I was very sure that I wanted to stick with the sustainability world and doing things that I felt had an impact bigger than just myself. And so that was my kind of point of continuity. But I started to explore what else might be out there. And I didn't really consider in-house roles, to be honest, initially. A lot of what I saw available wasn't really going to match for me, and either required a technical degree of understanding that I didn't feel like I had, or was very focused on the sort of storytelling part of the process, and reporting or media type comms roles, again, wasn't really what I wanted to be doing. So I spent a bit of time looking around, and then I actually got approached by a former colleague, a guy I'd worked with really closely in my first half of my career at Accenture, who had left to join Uber as one of the launch team in the UK. So Uber had come to London in 2012, but it had then expanded across the rest of the UK 2-3 years later, and they'd hired a bunch of people to come in and launch those cities as kind of early, at that point, still very entrepreneurial, quite scrappy business. So they put people in charge of Liverpool or Manchester or whatever, and that was their gig. And he'd gone to do that, and he had a great time. He'd really enjoyed it. The company had grown enormously while he'd been there. We'd stayed in touch. I was curious always about his experience and how different it was to what I was still doing. And he got in touch with me at the beginning of 2019 and said, we've just decided to do this thing where we're going to electrify every car on the Uber platform in the next 7 years. Do you fancy it?
Awesome.
Might be interesting chance to put into practice some of this stuff you've been preaching. Let me know. Happy to refer you to the interview. So I was like, okay. Hadn't been on my radar, but why not? I like this guy. I wouldn't mind working for him again. I'd sort of have some trust that he knows what he's talking about. And secondly, this is maybe a great coming together of different things that I'm interested in. And my going in thesis, which I feel like has borne fruit, was this company is big enough to have an impact and it's growing pretty quickly. So things that I do are going to scale in interesting ways. It's clearly ambitious to just try stuff. It's got this 100% goal. That's pretty wild, given that they're probably almost nowhere on this topic today. So I quite like that, respect that degree to just take a punt on something. And it's quite a young company. It's quite new. So it has that scale, but it's not going to be somewhere where I'm going to get frustrated by the pace of change. And I've worked at some organizations as a consultant where they were pretty cumbersome. It was hard to get stuff done. You felt very stuck in the middle of a hierarchy. And I was like, maybe Uber will be like that, but hopefully it won't, because it's a tech company and it's less than a decade old, and maybe I can get stuff done. And that's quite an unusual combination. Scale and still being pretty agile is quite unusual. And this sustainability space is very greenfield for them, so I could probably get to choose my own adventure to some extent. And so I gave it a shot. Yeah, I ended up joining in the summer of 2019. Me and a couple of other people were the launch team for this project. It was Uber's first foray into the world of sustainability. I think I was the first person who had a job that was explicitly about addressing a climate-related issue at the company. And yeah, discovered that we were a long way short of that 100% goal, and we had a lot of work to do to get ourselves up and running on how we were going to make it happen.
So, Chris, my understanding is that a lot of those early initiatives have now scaled across the world, and we're very excited to get into that in a bit more detail, but often these things start small and incremental. So could you talk us through what you did, how it worked, what succeeded as part of that first of London pilot?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, London was definitely the birthplace of this work at Uber. There's a couple of reasons for that. It's a meaningful market for the company. You know, it's one of the biggest cities in the world by value and by volume. And so it made sense to prove it out somewhere that was, targeted and focused, but still at scale. It wasn't just some, small town and a place that was never going to be able to be replicable across the world. The other reason was that it was a really strong alignment between what we were trying to do and what the city as a whole was trying to do. So Sadiq Khan had come in a couple of years previously, made cleaning up London's air a big part of his priorities. Uber works best when it's a city-based company. It's got to work closely with the authorities in any given city. And so when you could align the incentives and the direction of travel with the policy of the city or with the transport regulator, it's going to be a win. So there was a clear common purpose there. So that's why we got started in London. And I think we did a couple of things right and a couple of things I wish we'd done a little differently. I think the things that we did right were we focused initially very hard on how can we help drivers raise enough money to make this transition happen. Electric cars certainly were then and still are now pretty expensive options for lots of people. And so if you couldn't make the core economics work, no amount of campaigning about polar bears or clean playgrounds was going to convince people to make the switch happen. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about structures in which we could raise that money quickly. And we managed to raise, just over £150 million by putting a small surcharge into the fare structure for riders. And as I was talking about a moment ago with the scale, those kind of things multiply pretty quickly. And so individual drivers had, not overnight, but fairly quickly, thousands of pounds that they could put towards these vehicles, and that was going to really help make the maths work out for them. The second thing that I think we did well was that we got quickly into the mode of partnership and building relationships with the industry. There was a degree to which we could do some of this ourselves. We could do the work with the drivers. We could raise the money, but we were never gonna make the cars. We were never gonna build the infrastructure. We needed to understand in a lot more detail how that transition was going to happen, who the big players were going to be, where we could get discounts, where we could use our scale, how we could negotiate. And so I spent a lot of time with we call our business development team here, do a lot of commercial partnerships on our side. In the first 6 months, sitting in rooms with car companies or charge point operators or leasing companies or people who wanted to set themselves up as intermediaries between drivers and vehicle providers to try and create an ecosystem of competitive offers that meant that as an Uber driver, you had a much better set of ways to get hold of an EV at a much better price than the average consumer. And that has borne fruit in the sense that we've used that playbook across the world, as you say, and a lot of those relationships that we established in 2019 or early 2020, maybe it took a little while to get up and running, and we didn't necessarily see thousands of sales straight away. But we're still live with those. We're still running discount programs. At this point, we've got thousands of those vehicles on the platform, and a lot of that has, I think, proven to be very valuable, both for us, for the drivers, and for the companies who have seen the uptake of their new technologies, which they were making a bet on too, right? They were making these cars assuming that the market would come, and that we were hoping to be an early part of that market. The thing that we didn't do as early as I would have done in retrospect was that we didn't bring the end user in to the experience that quickly. So we were quite nervous about launching a version of Uber in London, which was EV only or low emissions. And so we made it very much it's a marketplace company. It thinks about matching riders and drivers. That's kind of the core of the business. We thought it all about the drivers for a long time. And we held off on doing anything kind of consumer facing until we were really confident that the product was going to be great. I think that was understandable, but in retrospect, we probably could have gone a bit earlier with a slightly less great, but still pretty good product, because it was only really when we started doing that we saw the organic adoption of this thing. We saw the excitement. For a lot of people, there was no amount of storytelling that we could do about the work that was going to have any impact if they didn't see it turn up when they opened up the app on their phone. And so, that product is also now available globally, but I think we should have got going a bit sooner on the rider side.
Yeah, we see Uber Green's the first thing that comes up now when you try to book something, which is amazing.
It is, especially if you're a sustainability-friendly person like yourself, Rafi.
Oh, there you go. So I'd love to know, just like from your perspective, I think there's different layers of impact that you've had in London. Let's think about just London through Uber. So there's the direct impact you've had on the drivers and what they've been able to do. Then there's a sort of broader impact you've had through the journeys and what you've done with engaging customers. But there's a broader impact too as well, which is about how you've been part of the acceleration of the take-up of electric vehicles in the city. The accessibility to charging points have got much better over the last few years. How do you think about that? How do you talk about that? What are the sort of other offshoots of the benefits that have arisen as a result of the work you've done here?
I like that. I like that description. I think that's right. I think the focus was very much on how do we make this work for the community of people who earn their living through Uber. And I found that to be a really useful mindset to be in as I was doing the work, which is like, okay, these people are reliant on us to earn a living, and therefore, and the choice of vehicle they use is pretty therefore important. They're not going to take a bet on something they don't understand. They're not going to take a risk, and if we get it wrong, if we push something on people that isn't right for them, there's a high price to pay, and I'm probably not the one who's able to pay that price. I've got to be sure. And so a lot of that focus was on them, and we were working really hard to make sure we could feel confident that it was going to help people earn more money. It was going to be a better experience. It was going to be an asset that they should be proud to invest in. And I think we did that. But yeah, we were always hopeful that it would have that kind of ripple effect. And I think we have helped cause that, and then we have also benefited from that broader transition. Again, when I think back to the decision I made in 2019, I was taking a bit of a bet that of all the things that I'd worked on or were kind of live in the sustainability space, electric vehicles were going to be one of the ones that would become quite mainstream. And I think I got lucky with that, and to some extent that was the case. But I'm very sure that the Uber driver population, which is pretty sizable just in London, has been a great foundation for investments in things like infrastructure, for the rollout of new types of vehicles and the bringing of those to market. Partners will tell us that. And also to, exposing a lot of people. We ran some data, I think, last year and worked out that on average, a driver takes 125 passengers a month, and the vast majority of those won't have been in an EV before. And so some, when you multiply that up across the world, some big proportion of people are getting their first ever experience of an electric car in the back of an Uber. And, that's one of my policy colleagues likes to say, not every Uber ride is a teachable moment. Like, some people are just trying to get home. Sometimes they're not necessarily remembering their trip that well, but some of them are. And some of them are broadening interest and making more mainstream that transition. And then the key thing that we then also track on top of all of that is, are we able to run ahead? Is all of this work helping us be at the vanguard? So, Uber drivers are taking up EVs somewhere between 8 and 10 times faster than the general public. And that's a good benchmark for us in measuring that, because we can say, okay, that's demonstrating that we're providing something that is enabling people to go faster than just the general population adoption.
Chris, it was tremendous success in London. How did you approach the scaling question? And I know that you're working now across 70 countries, but how did you approach that question? And a bit more context on the business need would be really helpful. Why did the business feel the need to pursue this globally?
I think we thought about it quite early in the program. So we hadn't been going that long in London before we started conversations about where else could we make this work. And I think that's because we had some conviction that it was working, but we also knew that there were cities that looked a bit like London in other parts of the world that could do with a similar solution. So, the next place that we started was Paris, for example. Paris had a similar set of policy priorities, geographically slightly different city, but not wildly different. Partnerships that we could create with charging companies and car companies. And so the French team would come and talk to us and say, well, if you can do it, why can't we do it? And we had that conversation a few times, teams in California, teams in other parts of the world. And so there was quite quickly a bit of bottoms up kind of momentum behind the idea that this was a cool thing and maybe we could replicate it. And then there was a bit of top down trying to take the long view on, we think this is a technology trend. We think this is going to happen anyway as a transition. There's probably more and more path dependency being created as car companies and governments and others started to invest into the transition. So how do we get ahead of that, and how do we benefit from that transition? And what benefits do we gain as a business from being a leader rather than a follower in terms of reputational benefit or protecting our license to operate in these cities? And then the big accelerant, which I didn't think was going to be an accelerant, I thought was going to really throw us off course, was the pandemic. So I joined in the middle of 2019. That means I was just over 6 months in before the world got turned upside down. And at that point, I scrambled to do a bunch of non-sustainability related things for a couple of months and wasn't entirely sure that I would ever get back to the thing that I actually got hired to do. And was pleasantly surprised, therefore, come June, when I got pulled into a bunch of conversations that said, right, we need to rebuild this business essentially from the ground up. We've gone down to 5% of our trip volume versus where we were at the beginning of the year. As we build it back, how do we build it back better? And how do we secure this long-term license to operate? Maybe one way to do that is put electrification at the forefront of the new Uber. And could we get ahead of the crowd in setting ourselves some ambitious goals? And so then we got into a bunch of conversations about where would it make sense to do that and how would we do it? And we ended up in September of 2020 coming out to say that we were going to make this a global strategy. We were going to put ourselves on a pathway to being zero emissions company by 2040. And we were going to try and go as fast as we could in some of our more mature markets, so Western Europe, Canada, and the US, and try and be 100% electric in those places by 2030. And we published some research on what we thought that would take, particularly in Europe, in terms of the broader ecosystem. And so that was it was a big bet. There wasn't that we had worked it out in every detail as to what we were going to do year over year over that time, but it felt like we had enough conviction in the pilot and enough reasons to believe that this was the long-term direction of travel that we should put our flag in the ground about where we were trying to get to, and that would help coalesce a bunch of work that was happening internally into a strategy, and it would help us have much bigger conversations externally with partners where we could suddenly say, well, this is no longer just a one city thing. Like, we actually want to talk to you about how this would work across the US, how this would work across Europe, etc.
You mentioned license to operate. How much has sustainability and what you're doing there been a part of the argument that Uber's had to make in terms of license to operate more broadly? Thinking about the court cases in London, for example, sustainability been a feature and been a contributor to that?
I don't think it's ever been explicitly a binary, part of the yes/no decision, but I think it's very much part of the ongoing engagement and conversation, and about, as I said before, aligning interests and demonstrating that we're interested in being and making a positive contribution, and then proving out with as much data as we can that's true. So I think it's an important thing to be in the mix. I mean, the decisions ultimately are made on other factors, but it's an important thing to be in the mix. And it also helps find common ground with people. And I think, a lot of the cities that we operate are taking really seriously their need to decarbonize themselves. And in most cities, decarbonization is a combination of transportation and housing. If you can do something about those two topics, you can go a long way to getting yourself to being a net zero city. And a network like Uber is therefore a big part of one of your two big sources of emissions.
So thinking about the partnerships that you're building, how do you think about partnerships with the sort of commercial partnerships that you're working with the car companies and others? And how do you think about the public partnerships that you're building with government? So do you have a similar approach, or how are they different?
They're similar in theory, in the sense that what we're ultimately trying to do is find ways in which we can collaborate that's going to benefit the driver. They're different in practice because what we're really doing on the commercial partnerships is aggregating demand for their product or service and helping them underwrite investments in the future. So be that putting charging points in the ground, or investing in new ranges of vehicles, or bringing vehicles to certain markets that would have otherwise gone elsewhere. They want to see that there's going to be a market for those, and we think we can help secure and create that market. On the public side, there's some amount of the same thing. If we're talking to public bodies about how they work with how they put publicly funded infrastructure in the ground, for example. Similarly, they want to know someone's going to use it. But often it's less about that, and it's more about informing how policy gets made or decisions with the data that we can provide, and being one of many voices who are supportive of an agenda or helping to inform an agenda, and less about usage of this particular asset, for example. And then there's probably a middle group, which is not public, but non-profit organizations who we work with, where again, we're trying to find organizations who are pushing everybody in this direction and want companies and brands like Uber to be prepared to stand up and say, yes, we think this is the right way to go, and we think we can help get there, and how can we collaborate? So we work with the likes of C40, the big collection of city authorities, or Transport and Environment, who are an EU-based transport group who are making the case for more sustainable cities, and they want to be making that case across the private sector and the public sector, and we can be a useful voice to join them in that chorus.
Chris, with a company the size of Uber, I'm interested in how much of the initiative is centralized, as in you are pushing out initiatives to the rest of the globe, and how much of it is local first. How does that dynamic work?
Yeah, great question. I actually get asked quite a lot about how this sort of fits together, because I think every company takes a slightly different approach, and so there isn't a kind of playbook for you run a sustainability team just like this. For us, we made that transition I was describing between being a local program to a global program in a couple of steps. But the big one was at the beginning of 2022, where we recognized that we needed some amount of global coordination, and we needed someone to be the figurehead spokesperson for the work, and then we needed a team of people who were going to organize a lot of those local efforts, make sure that we were consistent in our approach, aiming for the same things, not reinventing things in different markets. But we stopped short of creating a whole function, which was going to be a kind of shadow version of the company, and tried, therefore, to keep as much at the local level as we could. So we have this global sustainability team. It's pretty small. I've been part of that team. I was the first person in that team back in the beginning of 2022, and there are still only about a dozen of us. And that's a combination of people who are thinking about strategy, people who are thinking about leading kind of operational change, and then an analytics team. But most of the doing is happening at the local level. And so we'll have a couple of people in that central team who think about our strategy for the whole mobility business, so all of the Uber Rides products. But then we've got teams in the US and in Amsterdam, which is our European headquarters, and London and Sydney and other places who are then on the ground, working with those folks, but on the ground, they're the ones negotiating the partnerships. They're the ones going and talking to drivers. They're the ones thinking about what particular intervention makes sense in their context. And I felt like that has been really important because you'd miss a lot of that nuance. If you run it all centrally, you'd probably try and impose things that only made sense in 20% of places. B, you'd probably always prioritize the same few places that were showing up in the data, and you'd find it hard to justify working on the longer tail of the rest of the business. And C, and probably most importantly of all, you need to have that pulse on what's happening in the business at any one point in time. So, we can set targets about what we want to do in India, for example, which is a big market for Uber. But unless we have someone as part of the team on the ground, it's very hard for us to stay up to speed with, okay, well, we just had this new competitor launch locally and they've done this and we should follow them. Or, we're actually having a big, other piece of work happening on a different topic at the moment, which is taking up a lot of resources. So can we change our plan? That kind of connection to the local business has been invaluable. And so we've tried to maintain as much of that as we can, despite having this layer of people who are thinking about coordination.
And looking at the local markets, what's happened in the last sort of 12 to 24 months? Maybe thinking of examples that made you sort of step back and think, wow, that's great. That's really contributing to our global ambitions as a company.
I think there's a couple of good examples. Probably my favorite thing that happens is when you get someone get in touch with you and say, we've just done this and it's working for us. And you had no part in starting it. It just happened somewhat organically, somewhat inspired by top level company strategy, but it lines up with what you're trying to achieve, and it's really moving us forward. So a good recent-ish example would be we launched an electric only motorbike product in Nairobi in Kenya. Lots of our markets in Africa have two versions of Uber. There's Uber where you get in a car, and then there's Uber where you get on the back of a moped. And the moped product is pretty popular. It gets you there a lot faster often, and that's where a lot of our growth is happening. These guys were keen that they did an electric version of that. So they went ahead and did it. They used a lot of the materials that we'd done, but I didn't know very much about it until I got a message to say, we're about to launch it with the Kenyan Minister for Transport. This is what it looks like, and it's going great. And I really love those examples because, as I said, if we were running it as an entirely top-down program, it would have taken us a long time to get around to launching motorbikes in Nairobi. But actually, as a bottoms-up effort, it was logical and obvious as an intervention that the market was ready for it and we can get it started. And then what we can do as a global program is take that and say, great, these guys have worked out a lot of the kinks on how you make this work. Now let's take it and think about how we expand it to a bunch of other places. And then the other thing that maybe a good example is where we're able to leverage some of these partnerships in a really global sense. So we just did a deal last year with BYD, the Chinese car manufacturer, world's biggest producer of electric cars. Our ability to help them enter or scale in a whole bunch of markets was really important to that deal. And it really potentially meaningfully shifts the price point for EVs for drivers all over the world. And so we're now in the process of working out how that plays out across the world. But we wouldn't have been able to do that deal, I don't think, off the back of one particular country. We were just going to them as Uber France. I don't think we would have been very interesting, but the fact that we're able to pull the whole thing together has been, I think, really powerful.
So amazing work on the mobility side. Split to Uber Eats. Tell us the story of the journey there. What is the challenge? How did you understand that challenge as Uber Eats came to be? How did you bake in sustainability, reusable packaging as an ambition? And now it's a really big part of what you're trying to do there. Take us on the journey of what you've done so far and what's still to come.
Yeah, it is a big part and it's an important part. So it was not on my radar when I started, either as a customer or as something I thought I was going to have to do in the sustainability team. I don't think I'd ever actually used Uber Eats until I joined Uber as an employee. We get some credit, so I've used it lots. But one of the reasons I hadn't used it was pre-pandemic, it wasn't as big. There was a real acceleration of not just Uber Eats, but all types of delivery platforms through that process. And they probably pulled forward a lot of the growth they were maybe going to experience over a longer time frame into this really concentrated period. So coming out of that period as Uber, suddenly the business looked super different. And so, we were in a world where on a revenue basis, it was a pretty 50-50 split between mobility and delivery halves of the business. A lot of our emissions were coming from deliveries that were happening. A lot of the growth in the business was happening there. And so we'd got ourselves started on sustainability on the mobility business, and suddenly realized that we couldn't really credibly go out and say Uber as a whole company is acting on this topic if we were doing nothing on the delivery side of the house. So we started a bunch of conversations with the leadership team there. They were very on board very early with the idea that this was a long-term bet that we wanted to take, and we had to take responsibility. And so there was a lot of buy-in, which was fantastic from the beginning. And the two big questions for us to answer were, what do we think the material issues were that we had to deal with in that business, and then where in the world could we do that? And where we landed with that was that there were two issues. One was the same as the mobility business, which was, how do we decarbonize all the deliveries? How do we get that guy who's delivering you your pizza off of his petrol moped or out of his petrol car and into a cleaner, ideally zero emissions alternative? That was number one. That was a lot of crossover there with what we were doing on the other half of our business. And then the second was, how do we ensure that delivery doesn't turn up with a bunch of single-use throwaway materials that you're going to end up putting straight in the bin, that you wouldn't have necessarily had to use if you'd gone to the restaurant or you'd gone to pick it up yourself. And that was a really new muscle for us. We hadn't thought about that before, but we didn't feel like we could start on a sustainability journey and ignore it. And so we took that on as a challenge. We said we would simultaneously decarbonize the delivery portion of the journey as quickly as we could, and we would help restaurants move to sustainable packaging, which meant either compostable, recyclable, or reusable options for their packaging. And we spent a big chunk of the last couple of years doing that. First, understanding all the packaging that is used, which sounds trivial, but is very not trivial as an exercise across the business. There's 1 million restaurants on the Uber Eats platform across the world. Each of them has a lot of SKUs, a lot of different complexity as to how they use materials. And it's not something we had to ever really think about before. We've been very focused on whether or not your food was warm and whether you got the thing you asked for and whether or not you were supposed to get ketchup with your order. But we didn't ever really think very hard about what kind of box it showed up in. So we had to build a lot of infrastructure around that. And then we had to think really hard about what are the right alternatives and how do you help people on that journey, where maybe the decision is less clear-cut than it is on the mobility or transport side. On the transport side, it's pretty easy to say that something is or isn't an electric vehicle, and therefore isn't or isn't the desirable state that we're trying to get to. It's a little murkier on the packaging side. Is that cardboard recyclable or not, and is it going to be recycled in this particular market? Is that plastic better or worse than the glass alternative? Can you really reuse that material, etc., etc., etc.? And so we've done a lot of engagement with experts on that topic. We've started up a bunch of conversations there, but I think it's been a really interesting learning curve. We've definitely been able to go a bit faster off the back of the experience we'd had on the mobility side of the business, but we've also had to get into a whole load of new spaces. And I think I'm finding that really fascinating. And I'm also glad that we took on the challenge, because I think it means we can more credibly talk about the sustainability work as addressing all of the material issues of the business rather than cherry picking the one that feels, easiest.
And Chris, you mentioned earlier in the conversation the 2040 target for Uber as a business. I'm interested in whether that is you see that as incremental steps towards the goal, or whether there are any, forgive the expression, moonshots. And I noted within that your relationship and partnership with the Earthshot Prize, which gives me a sense that perhaps it's more the latter than the former.
Yeah, we like working with the Earthshot Prize. They're a great group of people, and I really admire the idea behind that prize, which is to go out and inspire a whole generation of entrepreneurs and innovators and advocates and activists who are going to make this happen, because we've got to take some big bets. So I think we have joined forces with them in order to try and help scale some of those bets and to try and bring to life some of the stuff that is in today and tomorrow's technology, and use the privilege of operating a big platform like Uber as a way to help those find a market fit and find a route to scale. And also, frankly, just to stay at the cutting edge of some of that innovation. I was lucky enough to go to their award ceremony at the back end of last year, and to sit there and listen to people's stories and talk about the diversity of work that's going on and the ways in which they've had impact, and the sometimes frankly hard to follow science behind how they're going to make fermentation be the thing that saves us all. I loved that. It was great. It was a great deep dive into all of the creativity that's been put into this problem. To come back to your question, I don't think we get to our goals in 2040 with just chipping off a little bit here and a little bit there from our emissions profile. I think we're going to have to take some bets. I think we're going to have to think about the shape of the business. I think we're going to have to think about what kinds of types of mobility and delivery use cases we're serving and how that changes over time. But I'm also quite confident that a lot of that stuff will happen naturally, not least because Uber, which is a pretty famous company at this point, definitely been used by a lot of people, is only 15 years old. And we've got another 15 years before those goals bite. There's a lot of urgency here. There's a lot of urgency across the world to try and do something about this challenge. And so there's a lot of chance for us to reinvent things and change things. And there's a lot of change, I would imagine, is going to happen in the company and in the world that we can hopefully benefit from.
So thinking in big there, Chris, as we come to the end of our time together, how are you feeling about the state of the world? Are you optimistic about our ability to deliver an orderly transition? Obviously, what you've been distributing through Uber is shining light in what's possible in the corporate sphere, but there's so much else going on. How, as a leading voice in sustainability in this country, how do you think about the macro picture?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not always easy to be optimistic. I think, there are a lot of bumps in this road. There are a lot of times when I wake up and read the headlines and wish that was not the headline. And I think there's also a challenge, and I talked to other people in this space about this sometimes, of the downside of doing work that you really care about is that you really care about it. And so when it isn't going your way and the world feels like it's moving in a different direction, that can be quite difficult to handle. I would say, though, on the whole, I am optimistic that the necessity of the transition and the technological change that it is inspiring is more powerful than the sound and fury of any one day's headlines or news cycle or political cycle. And so whilst not helpful in lots of ways and certainly distracting in the near term, does it put us on a fundamentally different path that we can't get off of? I don't think that it does. Is it going to stop Uber from working on this topic? No. Does it require an amount of resilience to just keep going and keep chipping away? Yeah, I think it probably does. But I try and stay optimistic, because if I wasn't optimistic, it would be very hard to get up in the morning and want to do more of this work. And so I think it's necessary. And I also think it's fascinating. I think it's a really, when I think about what I could be spending my time doing, working on something that is changing quickly, that has that impact in the world, but is also kind of an unknown space still, and there's a lot of things still to work out, is a great way to stay engaged and motivated to think about the next challenge and the next challenge. So I'm not good at predictions. I don't know where we're going to land on in any given year, and certainly not in a 15 to 20 year horizon about the outcomes of this thing. But I'm happy to keep going, and I think it's important that we do keep going. And I think, there's some big underlying macro shifts that we should be not relaxed about by any means, but confident in the long-term direction of travel.
Thanks, Chris. And I guess final question from me is, what requests do you have of our audience other than to ride Uber?
Well, they should certainly do that. And when they do, they should, like Rafi, pick Uber Green every time, because that's going to really help us out. I think I have maybe a big request of the audience, which is not about Uber, which is just, when you're thinking about impact, it can mean a lot of different things to different people, but take seriously the fact that you have a chance in your work to have an impact beyond yourself. And it doesn't have to change the world by any means, but it can contribute to that bigger picture, and try and block out the noise of today if you're interested in what's happening tomorrow, because that can be very dispiriting and it doesn't need to be.
Put on a bumper sticker.
Yeah, and hopefully won't be blocking out the noise of this podcast. Chris, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Chris. Okay, Adam, Chris Hook, Uber, what are your reflections?
I really enjoyed that conversation, in large part because I felt like sort of like a parallel life, and I sort of thought to myself, well, where did my experience diverge and not have the opportunity to work at a place like Uber? Because it just sounded like a lot of fun and crazy learning. A few thoughts here. The first is I really loved how Uber effectively created a market for electric vehicles by bringing together every part of its kind of system, from working with the drivers to working with the car manufacturers to working with the electric charging points, and then putting, a surcharge on trips to provide the funds to drive the electrification. And if there's ever a virtuous circle, that is one. And I thought that was really quite interesting and something that they then scaled beyond, which is really interesting to hear about. And I also really like this idea about being a leader, not a follower, and how that had reputational benefits. And so even through the darkness of COVID, when 95% of their trips reduced, or they lost 95% of their trips, that was the catalyst to think, okay, how can we come back stronger? How can we differentiate ourselves? And a clear part of the differentiation was around electrification, which is clearly really quite powerful. And it's really interesting to hear more about sort of the Earthshot Prize and what will help take us to that level by 2040. So yeah, really, really interesting. How about you, Rafi?
Yeah, I loved it. Amazing conversation. Thanks so much to Chris. And shout out to Earthshot Prize and to the Deloitte team I used to run, who helped to run the Earthshot Prize in the background. I think Chris is a real shining light for consultants made good, right? I think you hear a lot of stories of consultants going in-house and struggling because it's quite a different mindset to like be operating in short projects where you're not really responsible and you have access to senior people and you are putting down thinking and structuring problems and accelerating change, but without being responsible for it. And then you go in-house and all of a sudden you have these very small problems that you would never be responsible for before, and you have to still deal with them. And it's a different way of working. And, Chris sort of made it sound easy. It's definitely not easy. I know from my experience. And in any kind of situation, when you're going from one mode to the other, and he's made it work. And he's made it work in a way that's clearly, thriving, going from like a relatively narrow London-focused role to now global lead for sustainability, not just in terms of mobility, but also with Uber Eats and the work he's doing there, which was really fascinating to hear about. So I'm really excited to hear how well it's going for Chris, and sort of see him as a real shining light of the journey of the sustainability consultant out into the world that, I hope lots of my peers and friends and former colleagues can emulate from what he's done. So a real privilege to hear from him and what he's doing. It sounds like some fantastic initiatives and genuine teamwork that are happening within Uber about it. Some of the examples that he gave, that story with the mopeds in Kenya is a beautiful story. So all power to his elbow, and look forward to hearing how it continues to grow and develop over the next sort of 10, 15 years.
Amazing. And ironically, I just had a notification pop up from Uber. So maybe they've been listening.
Excellent. All right, well, thanks to Chris. Thanks to Adam. And until next time on The Impact Equation.
Thanks, Rafi. Till next time.